abandoned on a quarantine island with the dying. A Lakota chief rode through fog to get her. The oar hit something in the water before I could see what it was. A plank, rotten. I pushed it aside without stopping. There's a kind of rowing you do when your arms stopped caring 2 hours ago. You don't feel the pull anymore. You just watch your hands open and close on the wood and trust they know the job. The fog that morning was the white kind, not the gray, not the kind that moves and shifts and lets you think you see things through it. Just white. Blank. Like the world had been wiped clean on all sides, and there was nothing left but the sound of the water and the creak of the oarlocks, and somewhere ahead of me, an island I hadn't been able to see from the shore since July. 6 weeks it had been. 6 weeks since the last supply boat turned around at the mouth of the cove without unloading. The men on it stood at the rail, and I could see them from the bluff above our camp, just stood there looking at the island, and then the captain turned the wheel and they were gone. I heard later they said the whole island was dead, that there was nobody left worth saving, that whoever was still in there had to be sick too, and why risk it? I want you to understand something. I am not a man who acts out of anger. I was 53 years old. I had buried my wife 8 years before, buried 2 of my brothers, buried 3 men who rode with me and were closer to me than blood. I had long since learned that anger wastes the body and clouds the thing you need most, which is the ability to think clearly when everything around you is confusion. So when I pushed off from the east shore of that lake at 4 in the morning with a borrowed rowboat and 40 pounds of supplies, and a rifle I didn't expect to need, I was not angry. I was just certain. My name is Chayton. My father's people were Oglala Lakota. My mother was the daughter of a fur trader named Rays, which is how I came to speak 3 languages and to move, most of my life, between worlds that none of them claimed me fully. By 1887, I had spent 20 years as the kind of man the government uses when it needs somebody to go somewhere difficult, say something complicated, and not get killed in the process. A negotiator, a go-between, a man of no nation, some people said, meaning it as an insult. I took it as a job description. I had come to that county in Wyoming to settle a land dispute between 3 ranching families and the remnant of a band my father's cousin led. Dull work. Paperwork mostly. Affidavits. I had taken a room at a boarding house in the nearest town and spent my days riding back and forth across land that was beautiful and mute and didn't care at all who held the deed to it. The island was called Heron Island. Nobody lived there ordinarily. It sat in the middle of Kettle Lake about 3 miles out, covered in pine and scrub, with a single dock on the south side and the remains of a fish camp that somebody had built and abandoned years back. When the spotted fever came through in late June, it came fast, the way those things do in summer heat, when people share the same water, the same flies, the same door handles in the dry goods store. Within 2 weeks there were 43 sick people, and the county had no place to put them that wouldn't spread it further. Somebody decided on Heron Island. Put them out there, they said, with a nurse and whatever supplies can be spared, and wait it out. Some will recover. That's the calculation. The nurse they sent was a woman named Elara Voss, 37 years old, German-born, trained at a hospital in Chicago, come west 2 years before for reasons she never explained to me and I never asked. She had sandy brown hair she kept pinned tight enough that you couldn't quite tell how long it was, and eyes the color of creek water in September when the light starts going thin. She wore the same gray dress every day I ever saw her. She had a way of moving through a room, even a room full of noise and grief, with a kind of absolute steadiness, not slow, just unhurried, like she had already decided the pace and the world could catch up. I did not know her well before the island. I had seen her twice, once at the dry goods store, loading a crate of carbolic and rags into the back of a wagon, once at a town meeting about the fever, where she stood in the back and said exactly 4 sentences when called on, each one precise enough that the room went quiet. She did not look at me in particular at that meeting. She looked at whoever she was speaking to. That was how she was. When the last supply boat turned around, I was on the bluff with my field glass. I counted the crates they hadn't unloaded. I knew what was in the original manifest. I had seen it because the county agent handling the quarantine was one of the men in the land dispute, and I had been in his office when the list came through. Flour, salt pork, quinine, bandages, enough for 6 weeks if she was careful, less if the cases multiplied. The cases had multiplied. I rode to the county agent's office that same afternoon. He was a man named Aldridge, thick through the shoulders, the kind of man who was used to decisions that cost other people things. He told me the island situation was being reassessed, that another boat would go out when conditions permitted, that the nurse understood the risks when she accepted the assignment. I asked him when another boat would go. He said he wasn't sure, maybe 2 weeks. I looked at him for a moment, then I left. I went back to my room at the boarding house, and I sat down at the small desk by the window, and I wrote out by hand a full account of what I had seen and what I had been told, with dates, and signed it, and put it in an envelope addressed to the Territorial Health Office in Cheyenne. I gave it to the boy who ran errands for the boarding house and paid him $2 to put it on the next stage out. Then I went to the livery and traded the use of my horse for the next month in exchange for the use of a rowboat that belonged to a man named Kettrick who kept it on the East Shore and hadn't used it since spring. Then I went to sleep. I woke at 3 in the morning. The air had that particular cold in it that comes in late August in Wyoming, the kind that feels like the earth is remembering what winter feels like and deciding to practice. I dressed in my warmest clothes and went to Kettrick's barn and picked up what I'd laid aside the night before, the rifle, the powder, the supplies I'd put together over 3 days without announcing to anyone what I was doing. 40 pounds, maybe 45. Flour, salt, quinine I'd bought from the pharmacist in the next town over, bandages, 2 blankets, a small amount of laudanum for pain, 3 pounds of jerked venison, dried beans, matches in a wax pouch, a bottle of kerosene. I carried it to the East Shore in 2 loads and loaded the boat. Then I pushed off. The fog came up while I was still in the shallows. By the time I was a 1/4 mile out, I couldn't see the shore behind me. By 1/2 mile, I couldn't see anything at all. I had done this lake before, crossed it twice in good weather on a bet, years ago, in a different life, and I knew roughly where the current ran and where it didn't, and I knew that Heron Island sat slightly north of the direct line from Kettrick's dock, so I adjusted left and rowed. It takes a certain kind of mind to row in fog for 2 hours and not give in to the feeling that you're going nowhere. I had found over the years that the thing to do was to stop thinking about the destination entirely. You think about the stroke, the catch of the blade, the pull through, the feather on the return. One, then the next, then the next. That's all there is. You trust the compass. I had a small one, brass, that had belonged to my father, and you trust your arms and you row. I found the island by sound before I found it by sight. The pines along the north shore make a particular sound in even a light wind, a dry whisper that is different from the water sound, and when I heard it, I turned the boat south and followed the coastline around until I found the dock. It was just becoming light. Not dawn yet, that thick blue that comes before dawn when you can see shapes but not colors. There was a figure on the dock. She was sitting on one of the dock posts, not standing, sitting, which surprised me. She had a blanket around her shoulders and she was looking out at the water, and she didn't move when the bow of the boat touched the dock, just turned her head. She said, "I heard the oarlocks about 10 minutes ago. I didn't know if it was a person or something I was imagining." I tied off the boat. I said I was Chayton. I said I'd been in town, I'd seen the supply boat turn around, I thought somebody ought to come. She looked at me for a moment with those September water eyes. There were hollows under them that hadn't been there when I'd seen her at the town meeting. She said, "How many did you bring?" I told her. She nodded once like she was checking something off a list in her head, and then she stood up and said, "Come on then. There are 6 who are very bad. The rest I think will recover if the fever doesn't spike again." That was how we began. I will tell you about the island the way I remember it, which is not in order. Memory doesn't work in order, not for things that hit you hard. It comes in pieces, in smell and sound before image, in the particular weight of a certain hour. The smell first. Every building on that island smelled of carbolic acid and pine resin, and under those two things, the sweetish, close smell of sick bodies in a small space. Once you've smelled it, you don't forget it, and you don't mistake it for anything else. I had smelled it in the war, in a field hospital outside of a battle that doesn't need naming here. I hadn't expected to smell it again. The fish camp had two structures, a long bunkhouse that had been converted to a sick ward, with 23 cots crammed into it, and a smaller outbuilding that served as storage and as the place where Ilara slept when she slept, which wasn't much. She had been the only person on that island not sick for 6 weeks. The men from the county had sent one other helper, a boy of about 17 named Tomas, and he had come down with the fever at the end of the first week and recovered slowly, and now helped as much as he could, which was some. But he was still weak. And she had buried 9 people in the 6 weeks before I arrived. She had dug the graves herself, with Tomas helping when he was well enough, on the high ground under the pines at the north end of the island. 9 graves, with wooden markers she'd made from scrap boards. She showed me where they were on the second day, not as a grief she was carrying, just as information, so I'd know the lay of things. She said their names. She said them once, in the same steady way she said everything, and then she moved on to what needed doing. What needed doing was a great deal. I am not a doctor, but I am a man who has spent his life in difficult places, and I know how to work, and I know how to take direction from someone who knows more than I do. Ilara Voss knew more than I did. She told me what she needed and I provided it. I hauled water. I kept the fire going under the 2 big pots she used for the carbolic solution she washed everything in. I brought food from the boat and rationed it against what she said. She had a sharp instinct for how much to give a body that was trying to recover, not too much, not the wrong things. I sat with the worst cases through the night on the nights she couldn't do it anymore, and she slept for 4 hours. I dug one more grave on the 8th day I was there. A man named Hector, about 40, a rancher from the south part of the county. He had been bad when I arrived and didn't improve. I dug that grave alone, in the morning before anyone else was up, in the hard ground under the pines. It was raining. Not hard, just a steady gray rain, the kind that doesn't thunder, just commits. I dug and thought about nothing in particular. When I came back to the bunkhouse, Ilara was awake, and she handed me a tin cup of coffee, real coffee, not the roasted grain substitute, and I realized she'd been saving it. She'd had a small amount of real coffee in the stores from the original supply, and she'd been saving it for a particular moment, and this was when she decided to use it. I stood in the doorway with the cup, and she stood across from me, and she said, "Hector was a kind man. He kept telling me about his horses. He had 5 mares he was very proud of." I said I was sorry I hadn't gotten there sooner. She looked at me in a way I didn't quite know what to do with at the time. Straight and even and not performing anything. She said, "You got there." We didn't talk a great deal, she and I, in the ordinary sense. But there is a kind of working alongside a person that tells you more about them than conversation ever does. I learned that she slept on her back, perfectly still, and woke instantly when someone made a sound. I learned that she hummed very quietly when she worked, nothing recognizable, just a low continuous sound, the way some people think out loud. I learned that she ate very little but ate it deliberately, choosing what she ate, not just swallowing whatever was in front of her. I learned that when something went wrong, a fever spiking unexpectedly, a wound going bad, she got quieter rather than louder, narrowing down to the essential motion, the next thing. On the 15th day I was there, the fog came back. It had been clear for a week, and then one morning I woke to the white wall again, and I went down to check the boat, and it was fine, still tied, still sound, and I stood on the dock for a while watching the fog sit on the water. Ilara came down behind me. She stood beside me on the dock, Not close, not far. She had the blanket around her shoulders again, and she was looking out at the same nothing I was looking at. She said it should break by mid-morning. I said probably. She said, I want you to know that I'm aware of what you risked to come out here. Not just the lake, everything. Aldridge will make trouble for you. I said I'd had trouble with men like Aldridge before. She turned and looked at me then, and I looked at her, and there was a long moment that neither of us filled with anything. The fog, the quiet lap of water against the dock, the sound of the pines. She said, why did you come? You didn't have to, nobody was watching. I thought about how to answer that. I thought about telling her about the manifest I'd seen in Aldridge's office, the numbers in my head, the calculation. But that wasn't really the answer. I said because somebody should. She looked at me for another moment. Then she nodded slowly, like that was either the answer she expected or the only answer that would have satisfied her, and I wasn't sure which. She put her hand on my arm, just her hand on my arm, resting there, not pressing. She was looking back out at the fog. She said, when we get back to shore, I'd like to have a meal with you, if you're willing. I said I was willing. She said, good. Then she went back up to the bunkhouse, and I stood on the dock a while longer, and the fog did begin to thin, the way she said it would, and by mid-morning I could see the east shore across the water, just barely, like something remembered. The last of the sick recovered over the following week and a half. 4 of them were well enough to move by the 21st day. The remaining 12 needed another week. During that time a boat did come from the county, not the supply boat, a different one, smaller, and 2 men came ashore and stood at the edge of the dock and spoke to Alara in the tone men use when they're pretending they were going to do something all along. She listened to them without expression and gave them a list of additional supplies needed and told them to come back in 4 days. They came back in 5. I watched all of this. I didn't interfere. It wasn't my place to interfere. But I remember the look on her face when she turned away from those men, not angry, not bitter, just a kind of final confirmation of something she'd long since stopped being surprised by. On the day we left the island, the last 3 recovering patients going out on the county boat and Tomas going with them, I loaded what remained of the supplies back into my rowboat and untied it. Alara came out of the outbuilding with a small bag that contained everything she owned on the island, which wasn't much, a few medical instruments, a change of clothes, a small book I never asked about. She walked to the dock. She looked back at the island once, at the bunkhouse, at the pines, at the high ground where the graves were. She didn't say anything. She put her bag in the bow of the boat and got in and sat down. I pushed off. It was a clear morning. The water was flat and dark, and you could see straight to the bottom in the shallows, every stone. I rowed us out into the open lake, and it was quiet except for the oarlocks and a hawk somewhere off to the left, circling. She was sitting in the bow facing me, which was unusual. Usually a passenger faces the direction of travel, but she faced me. She had the blanket around her shoulders and her hands in her lap, and she watched me row with an expression I couldn't fully read, though I had learned her face well enough by then that I could read most of it. It was something like attention. Full attention, the kind she gave to the things she considered important. About a mile out, she said, "You have a place here in the county." I said I had a room at a boarding house. I said once the land dispute was settled, I'd be moving on. She said, "Where?" I thought about it. Honestly thought about it, because I hadn't planned past this point. I had a habit of that, planning up to the hard thing and not past it. Once I decided to row to the island, I hadn't thought much about what came after. I said I wasn't sure, that I'd been moving most of my life, that there wasn't a particular place waiting for me anywhere. She nodded. She looked out at the water for a moment. Then she said, "I haven't decided where I'm going either." I kept rowing. She said, "I've been thinking since you came about what it means that you came, not as a puzzle, just sitting with it." I said I wasn't sure there was much to work out. Somebody needed to come, so I came. She said, I know that's how you say it, but I've watched you for 4 weeks, Chayton. I know what you are. And I know how rare it is. The lake was very quiet. That hawk had moved on or gone high enough I couldn't hear it. I didn't say anything. I wasn't in the habit of knowing how to receive things like that. In my experience, most people say what they think other people want to hear, and I'd learned early how to discount most of it. But Alara Voss did not say things she didn't mean. I had seen that enough times on the island to know it absolutely. When she said something, you could hold it in your hand and it would not lose its weight. I kept rowing. She reached forward, just leaned forward and put both her hands around my right hand, the one holding the oar handle. My hand was salt-sore and calloused by then from weeks of rowing and hauling, and her hands were small and work-worn too, a healer's hands, and they just held, steady and warm and without any requirement attached. She said, when you figure out where you're going, I'd like it to be somewhere I could find you. I looked at her. She was looking straight back at me. I said, you could come along and skip the finding part. She looked at me for a long moment with those September eyes. Something moved across her face that I can only call settling. The way water settles when the wind drops and the surface goes smooth, and you can finally see straight down to what's underneath. She said, all right. She let go of my hand. She sat back. She looked past me at the east shore, which was close now, the dock at Kettrick's place visible, a blue morning haze still sitting in the trees behind it. I turned the boat the last quarter-mile into the dock. Alara stepped out first and took the bow line and tied it off with a knot that was better than mine. Then she picked up her bag. Then she looked at me with something in her face that I didn't have a word for and still don't, quite, except that it was something like, you. We walked up from the shore together. The ground was damp still from overnight, and our boots left tracks in the soft earth along the path through the cottonwoods. The sun was just clear of the ridgeline to the east, and the light was that early low gold that makes everything look like it has edges again after a long time of being blurred. I carried the rifle in my left hand, and she walked beside me, and neither of us said anything, because there wasn't anything that needed saying. That was 31 years ago. I have told this story a few times over the years, not many, and people always ask me the same thing. What was it like, the island, those 6 weeks? And I always say the same thing, which is that it was the hardest work I have ever done, and it was also the clearest I have ever felt in my life. Because when everything is stripped down to that, who is sick, and what do they need, and what can you do about it right now, there is no room for the other things. The questions you carry about who you are and whether you amount to anything. You're either doing it or you're not. She would tell you the same thing, I think. Alara is not a woman who mystifies things. She still rises before me in the mornings. I hear her moving in the kitchen, the sound of the iron stove door, the particular clatter of the coffee pot. We have been on our piece of land in the Powder River country for 26 years. Our son, who is named for my father, runs the cattle operation now. Our daughter is a doctor in Sheridan. Alara still practices when someone needs her. She doesn't call it practicing anymore. She calls it helping, but it amounts to the same thing. Some mornings I sit on the porch before she calls me in and I look at the country around this place. The long grass running south, the ridge to the west where the first snow comes in October. The 2 horses we still keep out of sentiment. The graves of 2 dogs, marked with stones our son chose when he was small. A particular quality of light on certain mornings that I have never been able to describe exactly, not golden, something cooler than that, something that makes the distance look reachable. She comes to the door and says my name. She says it without raising her voice. She never had to raise her voice for me to hear it. I get up and go inside. The coffee is ready. She hands me a cup, not the same cup I drank from on the island, but the same motion, the same deliberateness of it. She sits across from me at the table and we eat, and we look out the window at the morning, And I think about the fog on Kettle Lake in August of 1887, that white blank wall I rode into without knowing what was on the other side of it. I knew enough. That somebody was out there who should not be left there alone. That going was the thing. The rest of it, this table, this window, this morning, her face across from me 31 years older and still the truest thing I know how to look at, none of that was the plan. You don't plan that. You just go when you should go and you trust that the lake knows where the island is. It does, it always does.